Hello and welcome to another session of Asian Studies. This time we will discuss about the development of nationalism in Asia. This is because the previous topic or the previous video had uh, explained various changes brought by the Westerners in the advent of colonialism and later on imperialism. So the development of of various nationalist movements in Asia and its figures or head figures had redefined the continent's identity and how it was viewed until today. So, before World War II, or even during, at the height of the World Wars, okay, most of the Asian countries or territories are part or colonies, protectorates, and spheres of influence of various European and Western countries. That includes the USA. And during the Second World War and even during the First World War, most of the Asians during the First World War had uh, participated, no, directly and indirectly to the First World War. It, the reason behind it is because they are a colony or a protectorate or even as part of the sphere of influence of their colonial masters. And during the Second World War, they had also contributed, no, to the cause of the war, no, in exchange that most of these European countries will handed them their independence. Okay, so yeah, and after World War II, it was the start of the decolonization. Decolonization would mean these European powers or even the Western powers, that is, they are trying to uh, separate their identity as colonial masters to these lands, and they are trying to allow these countries or various Asian territories to stand on their own and later on achieve their independence. Now, let's define first what is nationalism. We define nationalism as a desire to achieve political independence. So, as we had said earlier, the advent of colonial rule and imperialist exploitation made by the Western countries, the European countries, that is, and even the USA in the context of the Philippines, uh, had arrived to the point that this Asian, or it has arrived on the point that the Asians started to stand up against their colonial masters or their colonial masters, and try to make an action, or it can be a violent resistance, or if not a peaceful resistance, that is. Okay, so nationalism, as one of the idea here points out, that it is the desire of every territory or colonial territory to achieve political independence. It is when these particular Asian countries are looking for a separate identity and culture, very much different from what their European masters or our European masters had imposed to us for such a long time. So this separate identity and culture will allow us to give a new and fresh view of that country based on its struggle towards independence, no, from their oppressors. No? It's a consciousness of one's country against oppressive outsiders. When we talk about of consciousness, it means from every people rising up against these leaders who are oppressive by nature and trying to assert their influence. That means nationalism has something to do with political independence, separation, and consciousness. Against whom? Against the oppressive outsiders. That is the imperialist powers. Okay. Moreover, it is a belief that states should be organized on the basis of nationality, that is, usually reflecting from a group sentiment. So, if you had noticed on the previous definition, okay, independence, consciousness, it also appeared here. Sentiment. That means comes from the people, from the idea, from the minds of the people to rise up against these people, no, against these oppressors. So the Asian nationalism is a response, no, to the imperialist and colonialist exploitation in the continent. So it is a response that is known later on, or some historians or even political scientists with the term anti-colonialism. Okay, so Asian nationalism is synonymous to anti-colonialism, but not all. Okay, because most of the countries under this continent had been controlled, or if not, had been part of the personal or the personal interests of various European countries, no? Kaya anti-colonialism. Okay. So what are the characteristics of Asian nationalism? So almost all involved, all countries are anti-colonial or imperialist. There is a struggle with an exception to Japan, because Japan at one point has a different view on how to modernize their country through uh, nationalism. Okay, some aimed at bringing down old order and creating more democratic kinds of government. That means to say, most of these Asian countries now try to bring down the colonial and imperial order and create an independent country. Okay, it involves reaffirmation, restoration of traditional order. That means most of these Asian countries wants to liberate themselves from their colonial masters and try to reassert their cultural and even traditional uh, order, no? I mean their traditional way of life, to restore the traditional way of life. National identities created by these multi-ethnic, religious, lingual lands which had boundaries created by colonial powers. So, because of how the Europeans had seized, no, and if not control most of the territories in Asia, most of these people who have the same language, who have the same ethnic identities or the same religious perspectives, no, had this armed struggle, or if not rise up, no, to fight against their colonial masters. Competing notions of nationalism often leads to civil strife or war, because not all the time it pertains to the concept of nationalism, not only pertains to the struggle between the nationalists and imperialists, but rather on how these groups of people will try to assert their leadership, their influence at the downfall of their colonial masters, no, pag nawala yung mga Europeans na ito, or even the Westerners na ito, no. So yun. Now, the following slides that I will present will give you a very brief background on the various reports that will be provided by your classmates about the nationalism movements in China, in India, in Southeast Asia, and Southwest Asia. Okay, so in China or in East Asia, that is China na lang, no? First, no? China, as you can see here, actually kulang pa ito eh. There are so many events that happened during the nationalist movement in China, but it all started when the downfall of the Manchurian dynasty and the establishment of the nationalist, uh, the Chinese Republic, no, established by Sun Yat-sen, and later on, a young student named Mao Zedong will rose into power, no, and embrace the ideas of communism, whereas Chiang Kai-shek is one of those also figures in the Asian in China, like, pertaining to the nationalism, to the establishment of the Chinese Republic. Okay, most of the events, no, that happened after the downfall of the Manchu dynasty pertains to how the Chinese respond to the British policies on their spheres of influence. Okay, and how do they had struggled because of ideologies. Okay, in as like what I had mentioned earlier, the modernization of Japan comes after when the Americans had opened Japan through the Treaty of Kanagawa. And Mutsuhito, the one young emperor back then, in the re-established assertion of the emperor as the main leader of Japan, no? During the Meiji Restoration. Yeah. So during that Meiji Restoration, and even when Matthew Perry opened Japan uh, to the Americans, no, the Japanese did not fear this particular uh, um, uh, Westerners, but rather they had tried to understand what does it takes for them to have the same qualities with this European with this Western power. So what they did is to send most of their scholars, with their experts, not to add to Europeans and American countries, and try to modernize Japan. Pagbalik sa Japan, this particular scholars or even experts, no, na pinag-aral sa ibang bansa bumalik sa Japan and try to rebuild Japan. And later on, because of this modernization in Japan, they had tried to also assert their uh, imperialist influence in the area of Korea, in China, and later on Southeast Asia at the height of the Second World War. Okay. In India, as I had mentioned earlier, India, or the previous sessions, no, India is a protectorate of Great Britain. But the movement of nationalism started when Mohandas Gandhi from South Africa came back to India and that, what do you call this one, proposed or presented his ideas about the nationalist movement in India. Okay, and Nehru was one part of the assistant of Gandhi, and even Ali Jinnah, no? And most of these particular people, Gandhi, Ali Jinnah, and Nehru, are one of the founding leaders of the nationalist movement in India. Before kasi, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, they are all part of the British territory. And later on, at the end of the World War II, no, 1949, if I'm mistaken, um, India was being granted the independence from Great Britain. And this also caused about this internal struggle between the Hindus and the Muslims. So might as well Ali Jinnah broke his I mean presented this influence or political influence also to Gandhi, and assured that they should have a separate land. You know. So the highlighted events that I had pointed out here are all aligned at the time when Gandhi is trying to awaken the senses of the Indians, no? Especially that when that Amritsar massacre and the Rowlatt Act was being established. No? The Salt March and even the civil disobedience are one of the techniques of Gandhi, or the so-called passive what I call this one, passive act, passive movement towards nationalist, towards separation. Yun yung ginawa ni ano eh ni Mohandas Gandhi, no. Didn't use force, but rather they do a passive way to try to separate themselves from the British rule. Okay? Now, in Southeast Asia, iba-iba ang naging sistema ng nasyonalismo. Sa Timog Silangang Asya, sa Indonesia, nagkaroon ng dalawang mga leader na binuksan ang consciousness ng mga Indones, no, upang tuligsain ang mga Dutch, no, in which the Dutch had totally exploited Indonesia. And Sudiro Bisodo and Omar Said, they had created nationalism movements in Indonesia, no, to allow to ease the tension between the Dutch and the Indonesians, no. So they had formed these particular movements, yeah, in Indonesia. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh and Ngoyen Giap were one of those figures that we need to consider in the development of the nationalism movement in Vietnam. It was really heightened at the end of the Second World War, okay, and it was uh, it was somehow concluded when Vietnam was unified after the Americans were defeated in the Vietnam War. Okay, Philippines at the height of the 19th century. This includes now Jose Rizal and other propagandists, no? The Katipunan movement, Emilio Aguinaldo, Manuel Quezon. Now, the propaganda movement, the KKK, and the 1896 revolution are one of those triggering factors, no, in the advent of nationalism in the Philippines, no. And it was continued in the Philippine-American War. And later on, Manuel Quezon had sent missions for independence, no? I mean, several Filipino leaders had been sent to the United States and asking for the U.S. Congress and U.S. Senate to to have the independence of the Philippines. And it's just so happened na dapat kung hindi nangyari yung World War II, 10-year transition period, no, yung nangyari sa atin from Commonwealth to independent country. Burma, this is modern day Myanmar, no. Yunu and Aung San were leaders of that established the We Burman Society in response to the exploitation of the British, no, because Myanmar was a part of Great Britain at back then, right? So in Southwest Asia naman, this includes now Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, wherein he was the very responsible person in modernizing uh, Constantinople, Istanbul, and the other parts of Turkey, no? He also became the father of the nation of Turkey. Yeah. It was in Iran, the Kahar dynasty is one of the oldest dynasties in Persia before Reza Khan came into power and changed the name Persia to Iran in the 1930s. And Reza Khan is one of those figures in Iran that modernized Iran through the oil depository. Okay, so Reza Khan also modernized Iran in such a way that they are recognized by these European powers, no? In Saudi Arabia naman, these two persons, no, Muhammad ibn Abd and Abd al-Wahhab and Muhammad ibn Saud, no, these people is they are rather the founding leaders who made a resistance against the British rule, and if not try to assert their political influence in the country, no. And when Muhammad ibn Saud took over, no, the leadership, he established the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the British already separated the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia when they were at the height of the first or after the First World War, when they had seen Saudi Arabia had become a stable country. Great Britain separated, no, I mean granted the independence, or if not lessened the influence rather of their influence in Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is part of the protectorates of Great Britain that also includes Lebanon and other parts of Western Asia. So what do all of these discussion would like to tell us? it talks about decolonization. That means the gradual growth of independence movements on the Asian continent. Because of these movements, no, in the Asian continent, it allows now uh, these countries, or if this group of people within the countries, to raise their voice and totally shaken the foundations of the imperialist powers in every country. No? So at the end of the Second World War, most of the countries in Asia had already become an independent country. Okay, so that's it. That's about this topic about the development of nationalism in Asia. It's just a backgrounder because there are PowerPoint reports from your classmates that will cover the details of the nationalism movements in China, in India, Southeast Asia, and Southwest Asia. So until then, please stay tuned and wait for the future video presentation that will be uploaded to your to my YouTube channel, and that will be linked in your Google Classroom. Okay, so again, thank you for listening, and have a good day.